called me the charity case at her own daughter's wedding, in front of 83 people, while the string quartet was still playing. That was the moment I stopped pretending our family was something it never was. I'm 31 years old, and I have spent most of my life being grateful for things I should never have had to be grateful for. Grateful for having a roof over my head. Grateful for being included in family photos. Grateful for being allowed to sit at the dinner table like a real person. My stepmother, I'll call her what she was, because that's the only accurate word, had a talent for making me feel like every kindness she extended was a loan I'd never be able to repay. Her name was Diane. She married my father when I was 4 years old, and from the moment she walked into our house with her good perfume and her careful smile, I understood, the way children understand things before they have words for them, that I was a problem she had agreed to tolerate. My mother died when I was 2. I don't remember her. I have one photograph. Just one. Where she's holding me against her chest in what looks like a hospital room. And she's looking down at me with this expression that I used to study for hours when I was a teenager, trying to memorize what it felt like to be looked at that way. Diane never looked at me that way. She looked at me the way you look at a stain you've given up trying to get out of the carpet. Resigned. Faintly annoyed. Present only because it would be too much trouble to leave. I want to be fair here. She didn't beat me. She didn't lock me in closets or refuse to feed me. What she did was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to name. She gave her daughter, my stepsister, Renee, everything. And she gave me just enough to keep anyone from saying she was cruel. Renee got new clothes for the school year. I got Renee's clothes from the year before. Renee got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a bus pass and a lecture about the value of independence. Renee's college applications were reviewed, revised, celebrated. Mine were handed back to me with a comment about how I should be realistic about what we could afford. My father saw it. I know he did. I could tell by the way he'd sometimes look at me across the dinner table with this expression that sat somewhere between guilt and helplessness, like a man watching something happen through glass he didn't know how to break. But he never said anything. He never stepped between us. He had made his choice when he married her, and he made it again every day he stayed silent, and I learned early that silence could be its own kind of betrayal. I left for college on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, and I didn't go back home except for holidays, and even then I made sure to keep my visits short. I built a life I was proud of. I finished my degree. I moved to a city where nobody knew me as the charity case or the stepchild or the girl whose mother had died. I got a job in hospital administration. I made friends. I adopted a cat named Duchess who slept on my feet and seemed entirely unbothered by the complications of family dynamics. For a few years, I thought I had escaped. Not neatly, not without damage, but escaped nonetheless. Then Renee got engaged, and everything I thought I had left behind came back to find me. The wedding was on a Saturday in June in a venue outside the city where I grew up. One of those converted farmhouses with white string lights and mason jars on every table. Renee had asked me to be a bridesmaid, which surprised me, because Renee and I had never been close. We were cordial in the way that people are cordial when they've grown up in the same house and decided, mutually and without discussion, to stay out of each other's way. But she asked, and I said yes, because I was trying. I was always trying. I drove down the Friday night before and stayed at a hotel nearby instead of at the house, because I was 31 years old and I had learned to manage my own exposure to certain environments. Diane had texted me 3 times in the 2 weeks before the wedding, once to tell me my dress needed to be steamed before I arrived. Once to remind me not to wear my hair down because it would clash with the other bridesmaids, and once, the night before, to say that she hoped I wouldn't make things about myself the way I sometimes did at family events. I read that last text and put my phone face down on the hotel bed and sat very still for a moment. The wedding ceremony itself was fine. Beautiful, even. Renee looked genuinely happy, and her husband, a quiet, steady man who worked in construction and seemed to actually listen when people talked to him, looked at her like she was the most interesting person in any room. I was glad for her. Whatever complicated feelings I had about our shared childhood, I was glad for her in that moment. It was the reception that came apart. We were somewhere between the salad course and the entrees. The speeches had just finished. My father had given a toast that was warm and funny and didn't mention me once, which was fine, because it was Renee's day and I wasn't expecting to be mentioned. I was sitting at the bridesmaids' table talking to one of Renee's friends from college about something ordinary, whether the chicken or the fish was the safer choice at wedding receptions, and I was genuinely having an all right time. Diane was moving through the room the way she always did at events, greeting people, accepting compliments about the venue, about Renee's dress, about the centerpieces. She had a glass of champagne in one hand and the particular glow that people get when they feel like they've pulled something off successfully. She was in her element. She stopped at our table. I don't know what made her do it. Maybe the champagne. Maybe she had been waiting for years to say it in a room where enough people could hear. Maybe she had simply never learned to stop herself because no one had ever made her. She put her hand on the back of my chair, looked across the table at two of Renee's friends who were watching us, and said, very pleasantly, like she was commenting on the weather, "You know, we took this one in out of the goodness of our hearts after her mother passed. A real charity case. She's turned out all right considering. I have replayed that moment so many times, the specific quality of the silence that followed, the way one of Renee's friends looked down at her salad plate, the way the string quartet, impossibly, was still playing something light and pretty in the corner of the room. My own hands in my lap, very still because I had learned young to go very still when she said things. I didn't say anything. I nodded once. The way you nod when someone says something in a language you don't speak, and Diane moved on to the next table, and the conversation around me gradually resumed, and I sat there smiling at nothing in particular, while something inside me went very quiet and very cold. I made it through the rest of the dinner. I made it through the first dance, and the cake cutting, and the part where the DJ played a song that made everyone over 50 get on the dance floor. I hugged Renee and told her she looked beautiful, because she did, and I meant it. And then I went to the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror and looked at my own face for a long moment and thought, I am never doing this again. I slipped out through a side door just after 9 o'clock. The parking lot was around the back of the venue, past a little garden area where someone had strung more of those white lights through the branches of 2 oak trees. It was warm for June, and the air smelled like cut grass and car exhaust and, faintly, the dinner rolls that someone had left half-eaten on a plate near the door. I was trying to remember where exactly I had parked when I heard someone behind me say, "Hey, are you okay?" I turned around. There was a woman standing a few feet away near the garden. She was maybe 60, with silver hair cut close to her head and the kind of face that had been pretty when she was young and had grown into something more interesting with time. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was slightly too formal for the event, like she had come from somewhere else. She had a glass of water, not champagne, and she was watching me with an expression I didn't recognize immediately because I wasn't used to it. She was looking at me the way my mother looked at me in that photograph. "I'm fine," I said, which was not true, but was what you say. "I saw what she did in there," the woman said. "I'm sorry. That was a terrible thing to say to anyone, let alone at a family occasion." I didn't know what to do with that. I wasn't used to witnesses who said anything. "I don't think we've met," I said. "Are you a friend of the family?" The woman was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her glass of water, then back at me. Something in her expression shifted, and what replaced it was something careful and a little bit frightened and determined, all at the same time. "I'm not a friend of the family," she said. "My name is Ruth. She stopped. Started again. "I knew your mother, Elaine. We grew up together." My mother's name was Elaine. I know that sounds like the moment where everything should have clicked into place instantly, the way it does in movies, where the music swells and someone bursts into tears and there's an embrace and everything is resolved. It wasn't like that. It was more like standing in a room where someone has just moved all the furniture 2 inches to the left, Everything looked the same, but something was wrong with the floor and I didn't know where to step. How did you know who I was? I asked. You look exactly like her, Ruth said. Exactly like her, Ruth said. I've been watching you since the ceremony, trying to be sure. I almost didn't come tonight. I wasn't invited. I came because, she paused again, because I've been looking for you for a long time, and someone who works with your cousin mentioned that you'd be here, and I thought, maybe, if I could just see you in person. Who are you? I said. I needed to hear it plainly. I'm your mother's sister, she said. Your aunt. Your mother had a falling out with your father's family before she died, and afterward no one told us where you were. By the time we found out your father had remarried and moved, you were already gone. Out of reach. We tried to find you through the county records, but there were complications with the file and… She stopped. I could see her hands were shaking slightly around the glass. I'm sorry. This is too much. I know this is too much. I sat down on a low garden wall behind me, because my legs had made a decision my brain hadn't caught up to yet. My mother had a sister, I said. It wasn't a question, it was just the sentence coming out of me while I tried to fit it alongside everything I thought I knew. She had two, Ruth said. I'm the older one. And there's our brother, your uncle. Carl. He's in Portland now. He's been looking with me. She reached into her small evening bag and pulled out her phone. She opened it to a photo and held it out to me with a hand that was still trembling. The photograph was of 3 children, sitting on a porch step. The middle one, a girl maybe 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, squinting against the sun, looked so much like my own school photos that I made a sound I hadn't planned on making. That's her, Ruth said. That's your mother. In 1978, that's me on the left. I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I looked up at Ruth. Why were you at the wedding tonight if you weren't invited? I said, not accusing, genuinely asking. She looked a little bit ashamed. I parked down the road and waited for the ceremony to end. And then I walked in during the cocktail hour. I know that was wrong. I needed to see you, in case you left and I lost the chance again. She looked down at her hands. I've been losing chances for 27 years. I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there was anything to say. I just sat there on the garden wall in my bridesmaid dress that I had steamed at Diane's request, and I thought about 27 years, and what had been happening in my life during those 27 years, and what might have been different. I have that photograph, I said finally, of my mother. In the hospital, she's holding me. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet. The day you were born, she said. I know that photo. I was there. I took it. I cried. Not prettily, not in the contained, appropriate way I had learned to cry during years of keeping myself together in front of people who would use my emotions against me. I cried the way you cry when something that has been pressed down for a very long time finally has room to move. Ruth sat down next to me on the garden wall and put her arm around my shoulders and didn't say anything, just held on, and the white lights in the oak trees above us blurred and wavered, and I let them. We sat there for a long time. Eventually, I heard the DJ inside switch to something with a heavier bass line, and the sound of people clapping and laughing drifted out through the farmhouse walls, and I remembered that there was still a wedding happening 20 feet away from me, and that my stepsister was still in there getting married, and that in some alternate version of this evening I was supposed to be in there too. I didn't go back in. Ruth had a rental car parked on the road. We drove to a diner about 3 miles away, the kind that's open until 2 in the morning and smells like coffee and pie, and we sat in a booth by the window, and she told me about my mother. She told me that my mother had been the funny one. The one who made up games and organized neighborhood kids and brought home stray animals that their own mother had to pretend to be annoyed about. She told me that my mother had been stubborn in the best way. Not mean about it, not cruel, but steady. The kind of person who decided what she believed and didn't move from it just because someone raised their voice. She told me that my mother had loved the ocean and bad horror movies, and a specific brand of lemon candy that she'd eaten constantly through her pregnancy, and that for years after she died, Ruth couldn't walk past the candy aisle without having to stop and breathe. She told me that the falling out had been about my father, that her family had had concerns. Nothing dramatic, nothing they could point to cleanly, just the feeling that he didn't look at their sister quite right. That something was slightly off in how he spoke about her to other people, that my mother had defended him, and then, when the argument went too far, had pulled back from her family entirely, the way people sometimes do when they love someone, and they can't hold both things at once. She told me that they had forgiven my mother immediately, completely, without her even asking, but that by the time they were trying to rebuild, she was sick, and then she was gone, and my father had moved and remarried, and the thread between them and me had just snapped. "We should have tried harder," Ruth said. She wasn't making an excuse, just stating it. "Carl especially has carried that. He's going to want to meet you very much." "I'd like that," I said, and was surprised to find that I meant it completely. I got home at 2 in the morning. I sat in my apartment with Duchess in my lap and Ruth's phone number saved in my phone, and a napkin from the diner that she'd written Carl's email address on, because she said he still used email like it was 2003 and would be devastated if she texted him news like this. I sat there and thought about Diane's voice saying "charity case" in that room full of people, and I thought about how I had been so careful, so well-behaved, so quiet my entire life, trying to be worthy of inclusion in a family that had never actually included me. I thought about my mother squinting against the sun on a porch step in 1978. I thought about Ruth's hand shaking around a glass of water in a parking lot. I picked up my phone. I texted Ruth. I forgot to say, "Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for waiting." She replied within 2 minutes, even though it was after 2 in the morning. "I would have waited longer," she wrote. The weeks that followed were strange and full in a way my life hadn't been in a long time. Ruth flew back to her home in North Carolina 3 days after the wedding, but we talked every evening. Long calls. The kind where you lose track of time because you keep remembering one more thing to ask and one more thing to say. She sent me boxes, 2 of them, priority mail, filled with things she had kept from my mother's life. Letters. A journal from high school. A recipe card in my mother's handwriting for a lemon cake she used to make every Easter. A bracelet that had been their grandmother's, and that my mother had been wearing the day she died, and that someone at the hospital had given to Ruth in a plastic bag. I held that bracelet for a long time when it arrived. Carl called me on a Sunday afternoon from Portland, and he cried for the first 5 minutes of the call and kept apologizing for crying, and I told him to stop apologizing because I was also crying, and we laughed about it, and then we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. And at the end he said, "I have a daughter your age. She's going to lose her mind when she hears about this." He was right. His daughter, my cousin, a word I was still getting used to, called me 2 days later and talked so fast I could barely keep up, and she was warm and funny and reminded me of descriptions I'd heard of my mother. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, something loosened in my chest that had been tight for as long as I could remember. I didn't call my father. I thought about it many times. I wrote drafts of what I might say and deleted them. I still haven't called him. Maybe I will someday. Maybe I won't. I'm still deciding, and I've given myself permission to take my time. I texted Renee when she got back from her honeymoon. I told her the wedding was beautiful, because it was. I told her I had connected with some family while I was there, which was true, even if it wasn't the family she was thinking of. She texted back a string of heart emojis and a photo of her and her husband on a beach somewhere. She seemed happy. I was glad. I did not reach out to Diane. I don't plan to. What I've come to understand, slowly, in the months since that night, is that I spent so long trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth the cost, that I forgot to look for the people who were out there looking for me. Ruth drove to a wedding she wasn't invited to and stood in a parking lot waiting because she couldn't bear the thought of missing me again. Carl has kept a folder on his computer for 15 years titled with my name, full of internet searches and dead ends and attempts. My cousin learned my name and called me within 48 hours because that's just who she is. None of them knew me. They loved me anyway, not because they were obligated to. Not out of charity, not considering, just because I was Elaine's daughter, and that was enough, and it had always been enough. Last April, I flew to North Carolina for the first time. Ruth picked me up from the airport in a car that smelled like the lavender she grows in her backyard, and she didn't say anything when I came through the arrivals gate, just opened her arms, and I walked into them like I had been doing it my whole life. Her house is small and warm and full of plants on every windowsill. On the wall of her hallway, she has framed photographs going back decades, her parents, her siblings, family vacations, holidays. I stood in that hallway for a long time looking at the faces. My mother is in almost everyone, and in the corner of one frame, behind a photo of my mother at what looks like a 4th of July barbecue, Ruth had tucked a newer photograph. Small. Slightly out of place. It was the hospital photo. The one I had. My mother holding me on the day I was born. I turned around. Ruth was watching me from the doorway to the kitchen, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, and she was smiling. "I've had a copy of it for 31 years, she said. I was waiting for somewhere to put it. I looked back at the wall. At my mother's face, young and tired and completely in love with the small thing in her arms. At my own newborn face, which I have studied in that photograph so many times that I know every shadow of it. I put my hand flat against the glass, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was pressing against something closed. I felt like I was touching something that had been waiting for me to find my way home. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that night. Not in a mystical way, just in the plain, honest way that you do when you look back at a chain of events and realize that one person's cruelty accidentally handed you the thing you needed most. Diane said what she said because she had always said things like that, because nobody had ever made her stop, because she had spent 27 years operating in a world where I absorbed the damage quietly and kept showing up anyway, and she had taken that quiet endurance for permission. That's how it works with people like her. Silence reads as consent. Politeness reads as weakness. And so she kept going, year after year, small cut after small cut, until she said it out loud in a room full of people. Charity case. And finally, I stopped absorbing it. I walked out. That part matters. I didn't stay and smile through the rest of the evening the way I would have at 22 or 25. Something had shifted, or maybe something had finally finished breaking in a way that made room for something else. I walked out into a parking lot and ran into a woman in a dark blue dress who had driven to a wedding she wasn't invited to because she couldn't risk missing me again. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Ruth didn't find me because the universe decided I'd suffered enough and it was time for a reward. She found me because she kept trying. For 15 years, Carl kept a folder on his computer with my name on it. Ruth showed up at a venue where she knew no one and waited. They did the work of looking, and I did the work, without knowing it, of finally standing still long enough to be found. Both of those things had to happen. What I understand now, that I didn't understand for most of my life, is that resilience isn't just about enduring. I was very good at enduring. I had made a kind of art form of it, but endurance without direction is just survival, and surviving something isn't the same as building something. The night I walked out of that reception, I stopped just surviving it. I made a choice. Small, almost unconscious, but real. To stop putting myself back in the path of something that had never been going to change. And that choice, that one small turn away from a door that had always been closed to me, is the reason I was standing in a parking lot when Ruth came out of the dark. Intelligence, I've come to think, isn't just what you know. It's knowing when to stop trying to solve something that was never actually a problem to be solved. My father's family wasn't a puzzle I could fix with enough patience and good behavior. I kept bringing my best self to a table that wasn't set for me. The smarter thing, the thing it took me 31 years to do, was to get up and find the table that was. And the moral piece, the ethics of it all, that one is simpler than I expected. Diane chose to diminish me in public because she could. My father chose silence because it was easier. Ruth chose to show up uninvited to an event where she might have been humiliated because not showing up meant losing me again, and she wasn't willing to do that. Every one of those was a choice. The consequences followed as naturally as anything ever does. The people who spent their lives making me small are exactly where they were. And I am standing in my aunt's hallway in North Carolina, looking at photographs of my mother on every wall. That's not luck. That's just what happens eventually when people show you who they are and you finally believe them. All of them.